I built Great Zimbabwe. Or at least I tried to. So, hi all. On today's Ground Up History, I actually attempted to build history from the ground up. So this is my attempt at a scale diorama of Great Zimbabwe imagined when it was a city. So on today's video, I'm going to actually be going over how I built this, why I did some of the things that I did, and some general history about the site. Okay, so here we are. I'm going to start off by carving out some rough kind of shapes because I want to capture the valley that Great Zimbabwe was actually within. And one of the interesting sites about this is that there's not actually any kind of water features like a river or a lake like we associate with most major urban centers. So what you saw me just dig out there were called dhaka pits, and basically they were excavation points for clay, which would be used for everyday uses in construction, but also gathering points for rainwater to flow into this valley between these two hills, which is likely how the people of Great Zimbabwe solved their water problem. Now, you see me cutting out those little bits of cork and laying down this glue. So Great Zimbabwe was constructed by these huge stone walls, and what you see me there doing is laying out what was the Great Enclosure, which was likely a kind of royal acropolis. So Great Zimbabwe is an interesting site. It was likely beginning to be constructed in 900 CE, but not really populated until the 11th century, and then eventually abandoned actually by the 16th century or maybe 17th century. And what's interesting about this is that the earliest site that was built was probably in that top hill that has the kind of rocky outcroppings you can see as a sort of temple. So this mountain range and valley likely had importance to the local Shona people, a subset of the Bantu, who would have probably been migrating around here with their cattle. See, cattle culture is hugely important across Bantu regions, and in particular here, it's likely that this hill had some kind of religious significance with its large sort of mountain encropping at the top, where a temple was constructed in 900 CE, and we've actually found at that site these bird sculptures that likely serve some kind of religious function. And the symbolism of those bird sculptures is so important that it actually features today on the Zimbabwean flag. But what I'm building right here is actually probably one of the latest sites that was constructed, the Royal Acropolis of the Great Enclosure. At least that's what we think it was. Now, you see me out there building this kind of exterior wall, and that was actually to represent just the edges of the wall, because the area of the city was likely 800 hectares. And that's immense, because a lot of the people living in the kind of valley between them would be farmers or herders for cattle. So I am building a few stone walls as well. These would be sort of enclosures that would represent the kind of middle classes of this Great Zimbabwe society. On that upper platform I already laid out, there would probably only be at most a few hundred people living there. So of a population of about 10 to up to 20,000 people that would have lived in the peak of this city, the vast majority would actually be in this kind of valley where the farming and the cattle would be. But there would still be some stone enclosures, just not as many. Within the Bantu society of the Shona, cattle were very symbolic of your social status. So one of the interesting things about this site is that it's sort of a combination of a more urbanized and sedentary kind of medieval structure of power. But you also still have the markings of the other facets of Shona culture where, you know, the number of cattle you have is symbolic of your wealth and status. You have other men working under you. So it's sort of a hybridization of cultures and a unique sort of urban landscape that we don't really see much amongst the Bantu, or the Shona people more specifically here. Now I'm laying out this upper temple ground and a little bit more in the valley. And this temple, unfortunately, we don't really know much about. We don't really know the specifics of the faith or any kind of ceremonial practices that were had here. So this may have been a site of, pilgrimage for all Shona people. Maybe the population of the city would rise and fall depending on the time of year, if there was some sort of seasonal religious celebration related to this hilltop temple. We just don't really know. And part of the reason why is because, unfortunately, this site was heavily looted. Outside of the walls themselves and conclusions we can draw based on their archaeology that's left behind, a lot of the actual artifacts themselves were taken. And it's an unfortunate trend across Africa that Europeans, over the course of particularly the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, basically just took everything that they could of any kind of cultural significance. And Great Zimbabwe is a classic example of a sort of pseudo-archaeological, pseudo-historical racism that flavored a lot of how Europeans saw sites like this. There was, of course, a widespread belief that African people were inferior, so of course they couldn't build something like Great Zimbabwe, so they would come up with these outlandish theories like, oh, it must have been the Phoenicians who built it, or some other kind of Indo-European culture. At the most extreme end, the belief was that it was constructed and was in fact proof that Atlantis had existed, and that this was an Atlantean site. Obviously, that means that there's a fair amount of baggage associated with the site, but in positive news, Great Zimbabwe is now a World Heritage Site and supported by UNESCO. And what's so important about that is that, one, it means that there's a lot of funding for further research and excavation, which has led to a lot of really fascinating discoveries. Like, we found examples of Chinese pottery or coins from the Middle East, which is proof that this was a major trading center. And despite being quite inland from the coast, where most of the trading we know of took place, Great Zimbabwe, as a huge central city, also had access to the Indian Ocean trade routes that brought across all of these amazing artifacts from that kind of pre-European arrival of the sort of medieval age. This might also mean that a site like Great Zimbabwe wasn't just populated by Shona people, but may have actually had, merchants coming from other reaches of the world. They may not have. It could just be that people traded at the coast and those resources made their way inland. But we do see in other places, like famously Kilwa along the coastline, populations of particularly Middle Eastern peoples or Indian people would settle in Africa, either as missionaries or merchants, even just on a temporary basis. So Great Zimbabwe may have been an important religious site, an important political site, an economic trade center, and may have even actually been a cultural mosaic for the Shona people to interact with the broader Indian Ocean trade and the many different sort of cultural resources that were spread as a result of that trade. But it also seems to have collapsed before the arrival of the Portuguese and later Dutch into that trade network, which ultimately disrupted some of those local trading. So Great Zimbabwe, in the way that, Europeans first encountered it, was already a ruin. And this likely happened due to climactic factors. Now, I already mentioned the challenges of the water problem for Great Zimbabwe, but with a population of 10 to 20,000 people, there would be a lot of farming and a lot of grazing of cattle, and there may have just been an exhaustion of the local resources to the point where it simply was no longer sustainable. It's very possible as well that, of course, the site was still used either in some kind of religious capacity or with, less major settlement, but the existence of Great Zimbabwe as a city likely ended around the 17th, 16th centuries. Even as a sort of minor population point, though, it's important to recognize how fascinating of a site this is. A lot of the architecture, you actually see me laying out manually all these little stones, would be built by taking sort of perfectly shaped rocks and laying them on top of each other without mortar. And that's really what I'm trying to capture with all of this kind of manual cork laying. I'm obviously cutting, much easier pieces to work with than they would have actually had, but these walls were huge. In fact, in the great enclosure that you see me working on right now, there's a tower that was 10 meters tall of these sort of stacked flat stones. That is the tallest structure from this period that we found in all of South Africa. So the purpose that it served, maybe it was some kind of grain storage or served some sort of royal or political function, we don't know, but the effort and time and symbolism of constructing a place in this manner, and with the artistry that went into it, they would stack with different sort of patterns of stoneworking so that there would be an actual design and pattern to the walls, something that I failed to capture at this scale. It really does show just how important this site was broadly and the amount of effort and time that went into its construction over hundreds of years. This is a place that's symbolic of power. So Now you see me cutting out all of these various little offcuts of carpet. These are sort of to represent some fields. I wanted to show that, especially in the valley itself, rather than, a traditional urban center where you would have a sort of concentrated, dense population with a sort of spread out surrounding area farming, with Great Zimbabwe, in fact, you have a valley channeling water. So farming and agriculture would actually be happening interspersed with the urban center. So interestingly, you would have more of this kind of dispersed small villages throughout the broader city, with fields and open grazing land for cattle all throughout. And again, this goes back to kind of the unique conditions of the Bantu culture and of the water problem that Great Zimbabwe faced, but also points to some of the challenges of the soil. See, as I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons it was likely abandoned was due to the, degradation of resources. It's likely that over-farming ultimately resulted in the soil not being able to retain enough nutrients to be able to consistently grow good harvests to sustain the population needed. But the fact that the population was able to reach around up to 20,000 people also indicates that there was a very intentional management of the local ecosystem. And even to this day, you can see that the hills and the valley are quite fertile. There's all of this lush, forestry, especially on that northern hill where the temple is. And part of that is because over the course of the development of the city, there was an intentionality to bring water into the area and to manage it in a way that was sustainable to farm. So Great Zimbabwe both stands as a lesson and a warning of the importance and value of water and resource management systems, and where that fails, an entire city that took hundreds of years to build, that had huge amounts of wealth and culture, religious, political power, all of this kind of symbolism tied into it as a centerpiece of a broader kingdom, could be completely undone and completely lost simply by a lack of ability to sustain the population through the resources available. Now again, due to lack of resources, we don't necessarily know, but it is fascinating to consider. Now here you see me laying out what's basically a texture paste, and once it dries, it's basically just a sealant for the whole thing that I can then paint on. So you can see right here I'm starting to paint those kind of rocky outcroppings, and with this diorama I'm actually going to be flocking most of it. Like I said, it's a grazing land and a fertile valley full of trees, so most of that ground isn't going to be exposed, but I needed a sealant both to help lock in all of that brickwork I just spent so much time laying, and also just to make sure that if there's any sort of parts showing through, that there's a nice ground texture. Now I'm also just going to, dry brush on a few different colors just to give the rocks some texture and some nice appearance to them, some browns and grays, and then I'm adding a wash to the actual ground itself. It came off a little bit pinkier than I was hoping after it dried, so I ended up using this black wash. I'm not entirely sold with how it turned out. If I were to do this again, I probably would have used a different color wash that was a little less overpowering and ended up making it a little too gray. But thankfully, at the end of the process, once I cover everything up with flock, it's not particularly visible anyhow, so, not really any harm or foul there. Once I finish doing all of this various washing and dry brushing, you can also see I'm going to start painting some of those little clay beads, and those are actually going to be representing buildings. Now, as I mentioned before, Great Zimbabwe likely had a population of up to 20,000 people, and at the scale that I built this, I can't show all of the different mud brick houses individually. So instead, what I opted for was a few of the kind of larger buildings, and I'm going to give these little thatched roofs and lay them out across the landscape just to sort of symbolize major congregations. So think of these as the kind of buildings that would represent, a storage house or a craftsman's house or a bigger building with more symbolic power, rather than the simple sort of one-story houses, one-room houses that most of the population would be living in, especially in the lower valley. And that raises another interesting point of Great Zimbabwe. This site likely was actually full of specialists. See, a city of this scale would probably also be a place that you would congregate if you were a jeweler or a metal worker or just a general specialist, beyond simply the religious and political roles we've already discussed. Part of that is just a feature of the economy. A more concentrated urban center with so much agriculture generally is able to sustain a population of non-agrarian laborers. But also, if this was a site of religious significance to the broader population, and if people say were migrating here with their herds of cattle on a, annual basis, There may have been a constant influx of food and other supplies from trading networks that would mean that the city center itself would also be a sort of concentration of the broader region's specialists. Like maybe in the surrounding areas where the population was more migratory, you wouldn't have the same number of specialists because they would all congregate in a city like Great Zimbabwe, so when once a year everybody comes here, they can all buy the metal tools that they need, the jewelry that they want, and you also have access to the kind of merchants who'll be going to the coast to trade into the international trade networks of the Indian Ocean. This could mean that a site like Great Zimbabwe, while also being symbolic of religious power and economic power and trade and political power, would also be a symbol of the kind of craftsmanship and innovation. We do know that there was a lot of metalworking that took place at this site, so a lot of the various kind of unique Iron Age designs of this sort of southern region may have originated from a sort of crafts guild that would have started in an urban center like this. A lot of this is of course speculation, but it is fun to think about. I love the idea of imagining this city, these dispersed sections of high stone enclosures, these hundreds of houses spread out over wide open fields, and these looming hilltops with the Grand Acropolis or the temple covered in their sort of lush forestry. It would be a beautiful and impressive sight. You would see people in fine clothing. You would see huge herds of animals as people projected their prestige and power and wealth. You would see all of the finest crafts that could be traded or bought from places as far away as China that would be almost unimaginable, right? Places you would never hope to see, but you could still own a piece of. A concentrated sort of cityscape like this can lend so much to the history of not just the local people, but the world at the time. And that's why stuff like Great Zimbabwe being a part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site system is so important. This is a place that carries meaning to everybody. Learning more about it can help us better understand the broader world of that period of time during its construction, and give us more context into parts of the world that go very often underexplored. As I mentioned before, Great Zimbabwe is hugely important to Zimbabwe today. It features on the flag. It's very symbolic to the people who live there, so it carries a lot of meaning, even to now. And learning more about it, trying to recreate it, has been very engaging for me, in part because trying to visualize how people lived there, I think, is one of the most engaging things with how history can be. Like imagining the day in the life of a iron worker in a city like this, what he may have needed to do, what religious ceremonies he may have participated in, the kind of people he would be interacting with, if he was able to travel, where he might go, the kind of social structures, the street musicians, the street food, all of these various things that breathe life into these ruins. Because if we just view them as ruins, if we detach them from the kind of culture and life that it once had, I don't know if it's as vibrant a place. But, an exercise like this, for me at least, helps provide a context, provide a kind of visualization for what that space may have looked like when it was full of life. And you can see me now laying in all of these little houses and buildings, like I mentioned before, trying to set up this sort of temple and the great enclosure. And once I get all these buildings sort of filled in, it does really start to look more like the city I was envisioning. And here I'm laying out some sand, and these tracks are representing both paths, but also actual channels that would feed into the dhaka pits, because again, they would actually dig channels so that rainwater would congregate and pool inside of those dhaka pits. So that water management would be really important, and I really wanted to make sure there was some visualization for it in the diorama. And you can see I've got this kind of lush green kind of color that I'm laying out everywhere with the flocking, and I'm being so careful about it. You see I'm going to take out a brush and actually brush off all the walls too to make sure they're still nice and visible. And this is where I had my biggest disaster with this project. So I'm going to spray it with this soap, and that helps open it up, and then I'm going to try to spray it with glue. And my spray bottle doesn't work, so I have to go off and try to get another one, and then it sprays way too hard and blows the flocking that I just laid out everywhere. So I decided to try to cover it up with some denser foliage representing, trees and forests. But yeah, that was not ideal. Actually, off camera, I ended up getting a different spray bottle that did actually work, thankfully, and I was able to sort of coat and seal everything in well. And I would actually also lay in a little bit more foliage. You'll see at the end when I actually have the final project done, there's more trees than you see me laying out here. But again, the main thing I'm trying to capture with this is really showing all of the life and foliage that would be here. I'm pouring in some water effects. It is going to dry much shallower than that, but yeah, I'm so pleased with this space. I think it came out better than I had hoped, and I hope that you enjoyed this story and how it looked. I'm going to show you a few of the final videos here, just without some music. So yeah, that's the video. Thank you so much for watching. I'm really pleased with how this came out. Now I have this fun little diorama to try to find a place for in my apartment that the cat won't get at. But I really enjoyed actually this exercise. It was fun trying to actually create a scale replica of how a place might have been, trying to visualize, what life was like in that kind of ancient past. Has always been a fascination of mine. So I'll probably do this style of video again, so if you enjoyed this one, please subscribe. I'll probably have more like it in the future, and otherwise I have a lot of other videos on my channel, like more classic video essay kind of stuff, so you can go check out those as well if that's more your speed. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. There's going to be some other videos here, and have a good one.